Hey ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. So we want to deal with user permissions in this video. But before we do that, let's do one final thing here. So in the Thunder PHP here, if we go to our command line to Thunder PHP in the Thunder folder here, you'll see that we have one more thing we haven't dealt with. So we have the migrate, rollback, but not the refresh. I don't even read this text. Does a rollback followed by a migration. So let me remove all of this. Okay, so it does a rollback followed by migration. So it will delete it will drop the table and then run the migration one more time. So you want it to work just like these other two, but we should have this. Now, remember that to refresh, you are doing a rollback and then a migration. So we already have both of these functions. It's just that this one should do them all at once. So we don't really need to rewrite the code. We can just run these two functions whenever this is called. All right. So how can we achieve that? Now, if I go up here, there's this part where it says if is equal to migrate or migrate rollback. So I can actually just copy this. Let me come down here. So there is where we need our else statement and put another if statement over here. And then let's remove, let me remove this one here. So this one is refresh, like that. Okay, so migrate, refresh. That way we can deal with this one. So in this one, all we have to do is run the migrate function. And if you think about it, to run the migrate function, we just need to say this migrate, but then give different actions here, so that in this case it comes here, right? So what we're gonna do is this. We're gonna say this like that and say migrate. So we are calling the same function we're in right now, but we're going to give very different params here, because remember that this receives an array of arguments, and the first item is this one, so which means 0 is not counted here. So we have to be careful how we add this. This should be on location number 1, 2, and 3. So at this point we can just grab the same values that we're given here, file name, folder, and action, and just apply them again, but we change what the action contains. So the action should now contain rollback. Okay, so I'm going to come back here. So in the first array item, usually there's the name of the file that we're accessing, so we'll just call it Thunder because that's what it is. And then in here we'll put the action. So the action here matters because if we redo this, we're going to create an infinite loop. So we don't want to create that infinite loop. We're going to say migrate to call this very function, but here we say rollback, like so. Okay, great. And then the second thing is the folder name. So we don't know the folder name, so we're just going to grab what's already there, and then we will put file name here if it does exist. So there it is. That should do the trick. So we roll back if there's a file name, or we roll back in that folder, and then once again we do this again, and then this time we just run migrate with the same params like that. Okay, so that's all the refresh takes, just to run these other functions here. Now we can give it a test run, of course, because we need to be sure that it's actually working. So let's try with the users table. What I'm going to do in the users table is just to add a row. That way we know when we roll back that if it's empty, we know things were deleted. So I'm going to add information here, and this is all I need actually. The others can be nullable, so it won't matter if I give values. So if I browse here, we have 2 records here, so that's great. But now let's try to run a Rowback. So I'm going to do cmd, and of course we need to navigate to our project folder. So being lazy, I'm just going to copy that. So let's do cd, and there we go. Let's clear the screen and do PHP Thunder, and then we'll say migrate and say refresh, and this time we're targeting the basic auth folder. So let's target the whole folder and see if that actually works. So I'm gonna press enter. So undefined variable file name. Okay. Tables deleted successfully. Okay. So I doubt that actually worked, but let's see. Okay, so it's true. The table does not exist anymore. That particular table. So what's going on here? Let me refresh this. Okay, so there are no tables anymore. So it failed to do it did the rollback because it didn't need that variable, but it failed to. Okay, wait a second here. Also, we just say rollback complete here. Actually, we don't need any messages. These messages will be, yeah, you should echo those messages. So folder and file name. Okay, so file name has a it doesn't matter because it wasn't needed. So what did happen here? There we go. File name. Okay, so let's try this again. I'm gonna type rollback. Oops. Okay, so migration file inserted. That's great. So it actually worked this time. Did it though? Okay, let me refresh this page. What's happening? What's happening? Okay, so no tables. What does it say? Okay, so it deleted the table, but it doesn't. So the deleting works just fine, but the migrate does not work. So migrate rollback and then migrate. Okay. What is happening? Action migrate, yes. Migrate rollback, yes. Okay. What is going on? Am I missing something? Okay, let's try again. Anyway, refresh, boom. Okay, so the deleting works fine, but why? Okay, so I see what the problem is. So the problem is right here. Because on the end here, what we are doing is we are putting that true to die. So we need to remove that. So yeah, it doesn't matter here. We can remove these because there's nothing coming down here anyway. So that is okay. Migration complete. This is the end anyway, so we don't need to add anything more. Which is weird here because I had put that end, so which means it never got to this line anyway. Okay, so some mistakes there. No migration files found in that location. Okay. This would present a problem as well. Okay. Yeah, that would present a problem. So, okay, instead of what's this? Instead of putting this a die inside this true, I think the best thing to do is return instead of die. So say if die, let's do return, because these are actually functions, so we can exit the function. That way even this function gets to run as well. Okay, so I think that sorts the problem. So let's try again. So CLS, let's do PHP Thunder, and we're going to say migrate, and say refresh, and then basic auth. Let's refresh. Okay, so migrating file deleted successfully, and then migration complete. Migrating file, blah blah blah, tables complete. Why does this have a space over here? Where is this table? Where is this information? I should just do a search, probably. Come on. Let's say table. What's that? Table created successfully. Okay, so I want to search for table, and I can't find it. What is going on? Let me search for success. What is going on? Where is this? Where is the message coming from? Okay, so when we are migrating file, migrate up and down. Oh, now I remember. There's a migration model over here, which I completely forgot about. So there's a space on this end of things. So let me not leave a space there. That's just throwing me off. So let's remove those spaces from there. And the same thing here. Alrighty then. So if I go to my PHP My Admin, I should find tables this time. So there it is. So we have the users table. Okay, so the refresh is working as intended. So we can forget about that for now. Alright, now with that in mind, let's go to our function that we are here to do, which is the user can function. So as you can see, we have global app here, which we need to put stuff in there. So what we're going to do is add user permissions to this. We're going to do this first of all. Okay, so this will be a string. Now, like I have said many times, if you're not using PHP 8, this don't do. And then it returns a boolean here, true or false. Now, the way we've structured this, we expect sometimes to receive a null object, a null value, an empty value, because certain times we are reading permissions from the database, and the database is allowed to store null values or new like that. So we expect this could be a null value that is supplied here. So we can do it like this. Now, instead of typing it like this, you can actually do it this way instead. You can put a question mark like that. So this just means you're expecting a string, but it's nullable as well. It can be a null value. You can do the same thing here if you're expecting the answer to be a boolean, but it could be null. So you can do it like this instead of having to do it this way. But either will work just fine. So let's put it like that. Now here, first of all, let's look at the permission. So I want you to understand the process that will happen here. So we have that, if we go to the index.php for a second here, there is this app permissions, right? App permissions. So we're going to add app user permissions like that, but we don't actually need to add it here. We can just evoke it when checking for permissions. We can create it then, so we can reduce the amount of code here. But the idea is that this contains all the permissions possible on the website. So every single permission is stored in here. Okay. Then we need a second one to store the ones the current logged in user is allowed to do. So let's say maybe there is in all the permissions, there's add user, edit user, and delete user. So there's just 3 permissions, right? But then the current logged in user is allowed to simply add a user. So we'll have the app permissions that has all 3, but then the user permission that just tells us this user can only add a user. So in this case, we will check. So this is why we're evoking the global app there. We want to add information to it. So I'm going to say app. First of all, let's check if it's empty. So we'll say if empty app, like that. So if it is empty, then let's create an empty version of it. So user permissions like that. So let me grab that and put it here, because we're checking for that specific value. So if it's empty, then app permissions is equal to an empty array, like that, so that we make sure by the time we're here, it actually does exist. So after we do that, the only thing we need to do is check if this permission we are being asked to check for actually exists in here. So all you have to do is say here we will return false at the end, because we want to return true only for very specific situations. So we're going to put an if statement and say if in array. So we're checking to see if the needle is there in the overall array. So the needle in this case is these permissions. We'll paste it there. The haystack is where we're checking to see if it exists in user permissions. So these are the permissions the user is allowed to do. If it does exist, then we return true, like that. Any other situation, we return false. So simple and straightforward here. Now, this is where the thing comes in here. The question is, how do we tell the application what permissions this user is allowed to do? Now, we can add these manually. We want to allow each plugin to be able to access this information. So let's say I put a users manager plugin, right? And someone logs in. So how does the users plugin manager know that this current user can edit other users? Well, it has to give those permissions, and those permissions could come from the database. Most of the time, that's what will happen, because that's where you store user information. So somebody will select that this user can do this and that and that, and all that information is saved in the database. But because we don't want to tie this framework to a database, because how we create tables in a database is very specific to your specific project. So we don't want to limit how user permissions are saved on the database. This is up to each particular plugin. So each plugin can decide how it wants to save those params. It can also decide who is an admin and who is not. We don't want to fix that to the framework, because if we do that, then everyone in the framework will be forced to do things a certain way, a very specific way. Then we're defeating the whole purpose of having flexible plugins. So in order to not allow that, what we would do instead, we'll use our very good function here called add filter. So I'm going to copy this and let's put that over here. So we say user permissions is equal to, let's do a filter here. Let's filter these guys out, and we'll filter these. So do filter here, we are creating a filter. Now the name you give this filter is entirely up to you. So for me, I will call it B4 check permissions. So put names that you can relate with here, and then so every time we put this, we're allowing any plugin to modify this data before we check over here. So do check here, and then we put the same variable array there, like so. So the moment we do this, we're allowing any plugin to edit this data before it's verified down here. So what this means in reality is that, let's say I have like a plugin that's user manager. So this is empty at this point. Let's imagine this is empty at this point, right? And what will happen is, when we get to this point, the users manager is going to read from the database, because the users manager knows how it stores permissions by itself in the database. So it's a good candidate to get those values instead of this function knowing any of that. Then once it gets all the permissions that that particular user is allowed, then it will add them to this array. And then by the time we get here, we are checking, say, oh, is this guy inside this array that we're being presented here? If it is, true, otherwise false. So don't worry if you're not getting it at this point. It will be very obvious once we start using it what's going on. So the point here is that everywhere where in this particular framework where you want things to be editable by plugins, this is what you do. You put a filter there. You say do filter over here, edit my content. So you just grab this content, give it a hook name, and then put that content in there. So this content will be supplied here, but by the time it comes out there, it will be modified by other plugins. So the more of these are like breakpoints. The more of these breakpoints you add, the more flexible your plugin, your framework is going to be. So sometimes there are places where I don't add this do filter. If you feel like those places would do with a filter so that plugins can edit that information, you can actually do that. You can put filters even here, for example, where you can edit the supplied data, maybe the key. You can allow a plugin to edit it before any of this happens. So you can put after, before, and after. So as you can see here, I say before check permissions. If you want, you can put another one after checking. Maybe you want to add permissions after they've been checked, which doesn't make much sense, but you never know what situation you might need that for. All right, so with that in mind, let's add a few more things here. So there will be times when you want something to be accessible to everyone. So in that situation, you don't have a need to say to check if a user can do that. But for the sake of certain times when you're in a loop and you don't want to check if something, the permission is empty or not and stuff like that, you can just say if, for example, the permission supplied is empty, right? Like that, then you return true, like so. Okay, that will come in handy at some point. If no permission is supplied, then we just say this is accessible to everyone. At this point, please do not do this. Where is this? Do not do this. This means entirely something else. It's not going to work as this works. So keep that in mind. All right, so if empty permissions, return true. And then, even before that, we want two situations. If permission, this permission that is applied is equal to, we're going to have two special permissions. One of them is called logged in, like that. Okay, and the other one is called not logged in, like that. So these are handy as well. Okay, so logged in is going to check if the user is logged in. So at this point, we're just going to say if. So in this case, we're going to need the session data. So we're going to do this. Now there's a thing that we created in the session thingy, so I want to check if it actually exists. Oh, we didn't check it. Oh, there it is. So is logged in right there. So come back here and let's deal with that guy. So say if session is logged in, this is a function, so we do this, then we return true. Sorry about that. Oops. Otherwise, we return false. We don't need to wait for it to go to the end and start checking all these. That's a waste of processing power. Let's just return false if that isn't true over here. So in the same way here, not logged in, there are certain times you want things to only be available. This works very well for menu pages. There are certain times you want certain menu pages to be available before someone logs in, and then something different entirely when they log in. So I've used that a lot in, for example, like information systems. And then at the same time, let's say a company runs an application where that's where they save all the business information, let's say the sales. But then when somebody accesses their website, or maybe it's a point of sale, for example, you want when users are logged in, it works like a point of sale, but before they're logged in, it just serves information to the users. So that is useful as well. So here we will do the opposite. Okay, so not logged in. We will just do the opposite here and say if user not logged in, then we return true. Like that. Otherwise, we return false. Okay, great. Simple and straightforward. You could put an else statement here instead so that we don't bother with this, but it's fine because once it goes in here, it's going to return anyway. So not a big deal there either. Then there's one more situation here. If it's none of these, then it's possible the user is an admin. So we have to check for that as well. So if so in this situation, we're just going to have a function called isAdmin. So we'll say is admin like that. Okay, so this one comes from the session, right? But this one is I'm still debating which way to go here. Let's try and put it here. So a disclaimer here is I may change this to just a regular function, but instead of putting it in the session class, we'll see. So if the user is admin, admin has rights to everything. So in here we say return true. We don't even have to debate it. We just say return true. Now you can put this at the top here instead of putting these first and then that at the top. Now in fact this one should be lower than this. Let this go even further. Now the reason I don't put this right at the top there to just check if you're admin and then ignore the rest is because this would take more processing power, even for things where they're supposed to be straightforward, like for logged in, not logged in. It's better to deal with things that are easier first. This in fact should be the first one of the list because it takes the least the least amount of processing power. It's just to check whether this is empty or not, then we are returning true. That way we don't bother with any of this. So the more processing power something takes, the longer or the lower it should be in the line here, so that it must be absolutely necessary to get to that longer thing before for you to get there. It means it's necessary you start with the easy stuff first, so that if it's one of those, you don't waste so much processing power. Now here we want to check if the user is an admin. Now this is a complex thing to check if a user is an admin because this entirely depends on how you design your database. So some people will design a table where they have, let's say, a username, and then there's maybe a column for a password or something. Okay, let's just keep it with username. And then they might have a column for row, like a user row, right? And in there they will put something like admin to say, okay, this one is an admin. So that's one way to do it, depending on how simple or difficult your website is, and it will work just fine. But in our situation, in my experience, especially with very advanced websites, you'll find that this is not enough, because certain times you have to give many rows to one user. You may give this user a row of I don't know, maybe they're in marketing department, and the same user can hold another position in a different department, and you have to give them permissions for those as well. So it's not just enough to say this one is an admin or this one is a manager or something. It usually isn't enough, but for many websites this is enough. So because there are many ways to do this thing, we don't want to limit how you want to check for an admin. So we will leave this to the particular plugin that you create to decide on how it will do that. Okay, so in my case, what I do is I create one plugin that deals with user authentication. That's like the main plugin that runs on every single page, and it becomes like the master of giving permissions and all that. But it's up to you. You can give this to any plugin to be able to do. So we'll create this function called isAdmin. I'm going to copy this over here, and let's go in our session. Now, before I forget, we're using session here, so we must declare it. We are not using it by this point. We are starting to use it here, so it's better to declare it over here. So I'm going to say session is equal to new, and we're going to the core folder or the core namespace to evoke session, like that. Okay, so we have our session, then we can utilize it down here. Okay, so with our admin thing, we're going to use this very system we've done right here. Okay, so so at this point, let me go to session here. This is logged in, right? So let's create a public function called isAdmin, and let's do this. So of course we know that an admin can let's put return false first. It's better to blacklist than to whitelist. Oh wait, is it better to whitelist? Yes, it's better to whitelist than blacklist. That's why we always put return false at the end, so that if everything fails, we just say no instead of saying yes by default. So we say no by default, and then we put conditions where we want it to be yes. So that's called whitelisting. Anyway, so at this point, what we want to do is, first of all, somebody cannot be an admin and be logged out. So this one we know for sure, right? So we're just going to say if this, something like that, if this is logged in, not, so if the user is not logged in, let's return false. So that one we are sure. Okay, now it comes to deciding whether the user is an admin. So on this one, we're going to add a filter. So here, we're gonna say, Now, if the user is an admin, the only thing we need to know is, are they admin, true or false, right? So here we're gonna say isAdmin. Now, please bear with me. If we find certain complications in future, we may edit this particular function, but once we edit it, then it's for the good of the entire framework. Okay, so isAdmin is equal to false. Okay, so we set it to false, and then at this point, we check. We say if isAdmin, like that, return true. Okay, that may be confusing a bit because we have this set to false, and then here we're just checking to see if it is true. Yeah, but what we will do to be able to edit this is to put it in a filter as well. So we say admin is equal to do filter, like that, and then we say before check admin, like that. Okay, before check admin, and then we'll put that is admin over here, like so. All right, so when we go to filters, the function do filter, let me find that function actually. So here it's expecting an array. That's one thing I have, so I think it's better to stick to that. It's better to always send arrays. So what we're gonna do is we'll put this, how do I do this? Because I want this to be an array. So I'm gonna send either true or false here. So for future reference, it's better to send an array because you may want to add more functionality, and it's easier when you're sending an array than not. So that's why I think we should stick to that. So here, I'm just going to put a key and say is admin like this, okay, and like that, and put this value here. Now I know this value is false, so we are starting with that, right? And then we allow other things to edit it. So I could just move this over here like that, so that we set it directly to false, and then we can remove this line. And then here we're going to return an array, because the result will be an array just like we are sending here. And then we will check inside that array if is admin is true after the filter, then we'll say yes, you are an admin. Okay, so this may be a little confusing, but let me show you how this would actually work. So let's come here to my let's come to the home page here. Okay, so we're on the home page and I want to check if I'm an admin or not. So what I will do is I will go to my plugins in here, and I'll go to, let's say, basic authentication plugin, and go to the plugin.php over here. So what I will do here is I can add permissions through this, but let's say I'm in the controller or in the views here. Let's go to the views, and I'm just going to do session is equal to new core session, like that. Okay, and then I want to do a var dump here of session is admin. Okay, so this is how you would check to see if you're an admin. You just say session is admin. This should return true or false. So at this moment, let's see what it returns. So here it returns false, of course. There it is. We know this. But this is how a plugin can actually modify this value. All we need to do is say add filter, like that. So I want a filter, and I want to do a filter before admin, before check admin, right? Like that. And then here I will put a function to deal with the situation here, and do it like that. Okay, so I've added a filter, and as you already know, here we'll receive data. A filter must always return the data it is sent. So I say return data, like that. So if I do that, nothing changes. If I refresh, you see we are still at false. But let's say this is my plugin and it knows exactly how admin information is saved. So it could read from the database. Here it can say read from database, right? To check what permissions I have, and then to see if one of those permissions is actually admin. So if it is true that one of those is found after reading from the database, what it can do is say data and say is admin, like that, is equal to true, like so. So once it does that, it now knows. So this can combine with the session class here to determine who I am, and then read from the database and to check if I'm an admin. So all of that can be, we can say check session data, and then read from database, and then finally compare to see if user is admin. So these are the steps that will happen here to check the session data for who I am, maybe my ID, read from the database, and then compare the data that I have from the database to see if I have any row that says admin. And if I do, it will say admin is equal to true. If it's not, it will just leave that empty because by default that is false anyway. So now since we've done that, if I now refresh, I will be considered an admin, as you can see over here. So this is how any plugin, it doesn't have to be this one, it can be another one, can give admin access to anyone if they deserve it. So all right, so that's how it is done. So let me remove this, we don't need that. Boom. Now in a situation where you disagree that plugins don't need this access, but they do actually, you can, to simplify the process, you can do the database reading from here to check if the user is an admin, and let's just return true or false either way depending on what you want here. You can do all that stuff in here, but then it means no other plugin can actually manage, it can give permissions but not the admin. So it's up to you how you want to do this, but for you to install a plugin on your system, it means you trust that plugin, right? So it should be just fine.